She walked out after 17 years of silence. No explanation, no goodbye. Just a letter and a secret she refused to share. Keanu Reeves was left shattered, asking one question. Why did the one person who knew his soul vanish? What she was protecting, and what she revealed months later, would break hearts around the world. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The office was too quiet. Not silent exactly. There was always the soft ticking of the old analog clock Keanu had insisted on keeping above the bookshelf, and the occasional chirp of birds outside the garden-facing window. But something about the stillness today felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was final. Clara Jennings stood near her desk, staring at the small stack of items she had carefully arranged on the polished oak surface. One cardboard box. That's all it came down to. 17 years of loyalty, of routines and late-night emergencies, of red carpets and whispered conversations, of unspoken understanding. Reduced to one cardboard box. She placed the last object inside, a framed thank you card from the Children's Hospital in Montreal. It had been a surprise gift from a young girl who had received an anonymous donation that saved her brother's life. Clara had coordinated it behind the scenes after overhearing the family's story at an event Keanu hosted. He never even knew. Next to it was a photo from a quiet birthday dinner 7 years ago. No cameras, no stylists, no guests. Just Keanu, Clara, and a chocolate cake she'd baked herself. They sat on the floor of his living room and talked about movies from the 1930s. She had printed the photo and tucked it away. Keanu had never seen it. Then there was the script. The first draft of a small indie film that had become one of Keanu's most personal projects. She had stayed up all night fixing continuity errors and restructuring scenes when the screenwriter had a breakdown. Keanu thought the original writer had pulled through. He never asked questions. He had trusted her. Clara taped the box shut slowly, her fingers lingering on the final fold of cardboard. Her eyes moved across the room. The bookshelf, the leather couch where Keanu liked to nap between interviews, the corner chair where she had curled up more times than she could count, organizing call sheets and press kits. This office had been her second skin. On the desk, beneath the base of the lamp, she slid a single envelope. Her handwriting was neat and unremarkable. Just his name on the front. Inside, a simple note. Dear Keanu, thank you for letting me walk beside you all these years. I am proud of everything we built together. Please understand this decision is mine alone. Take care of yourself. Clara. She didn't say why. She couldn't. She reached for her coat, took one last breath, and lifted the box into her arms. And then the door opened. Keanu stood in the doorway, frozen. He wasn't supposed to be home until noon. He had a voiceover session across town. Clara had planned this carefully, down to the minute. He wasn't supposed to see her leave. His eyes dropped to the box in her arms. You're really doing this? He said quietly. Clara didn't move. The heaviness in her chest tightened until it felt hard to breathe. I thought maybe, he continued, you'd change your mind. She swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. His eyes looked tired, not just from lack of sleep, but from the kind of fatigue that only grief could bring. I have to, she said. Keanu walked into the room slowly, like every step hurt. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. That wasn't his way. But the silence between them buzzed with questions neither of them dared to speak. 17 years, he said. We've done everything together. You've been the reason I made it through half of what this life threw at me. Clara set the box down on the edge of the desk. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling. I know. Then why now? His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. Why without a reason? Without even talking to me about it? She couldn't answer. Keanu stepped closer. His gaze didn't accuse her, it just searched for something. Truth, maybe. Closure. Hope. I don't want to guess, he said. I don't want to assume you're tired or burned out or bored. I want to believe you'd tell me if something happened. Clara's throat closed, her pulse beat loud in her ears. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, imagined 100 scenarios where she'd say something brave and vague and convincing. But now, face to face, she had nothing left. He looked at the envelope on the desk, picked it up, turned it over in his hand, then set it back down gently. "Is that it?" he asked. "That's all I get?" Clara's eyes stung, but she blinked the tears back. She couldn't cry here, not in front of him. "I'm sorry, Keanu." He exhaled slowly, the way he did when trying not to react. A pause, then another. "Is there anything I can say to make you stay?" "No," she said. Silence again. A long one, until he nodded once, slowly, like he was accepting a verdict he hadn't wanted to hear. Then, softly, "You deserved more than this ending." Clara looked at him then. Really looked. At the man who had trusted her when no one else did. The man who had let her see every part of his world, who had shown her grace and loyalty beyond anything she thought she deserved. "I didn't come here for an ending," she said, and that was the closest she would ever come to telling him the truth. She picked up the box again. This time it felt heavier. Not because of the contents, because of everything unspoken between them. The weight of the unsaid always cuts deeper than the weight of what's real. Keanu stepped aside and let her pass. She walked slowly toward the hallway, every step echoing in her ears. At the threshold, she paused. Her voice was soft but clear. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me believe in something bigger than myself." Keanu turned to her, startled by the words. He looked like he wanted to speak, wanted to stop her. But he didn't. He nodded, once, and Clara walked away. Down the hall, past the framed photos of movie sets and charities and cast reunions, past the shelf lined with books she had alphabetized, past the place where she had built a life in the shadow of someone else's spotlight, and found meaning in it. She reached the front door, turned the knob. The late morning sun was already warming the pavement. Birds chirped. A breeze rustled the hedges. Clara didn't look back. She couldn't. The door clicked shut behind her. Keanu stood alone in the office, staring at the envelope. His hands didn't reach for it again. His eyes stayed fixed on the door, as if she might walk back in at any moment. But the room was still. For the first time in 17 years, Clara was gone. She stepped into her car, placed the box on the passenger seat, and sat still for a long time. Her reflection in the rearview mirror looked pale and unfamiliar. She reached into her bag and touched a folded piece of paper, hidden in a side pocket. The real letter. The one she'd never give him. The one that said everything she couldn't. "I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I had to. Because someone found out. Because you would have sacrificed everything to protect me, and I couldn't let that happen." She closed her eyes. Her hand let go of the letter. Then she started the engine. The road ahead looked exactly the same as always, but nothing about her life would ever feel familiar again. And back in that quiet office, with sunlight spilling across the wooden floor and a clock ticking too loudly in the silence, Keanu Reeves sat alone with a goodbye he didn't understand, and a heartbreak he couldn't explain. 17 years earlier, Clara Jennings stood outside a production trailer in downtown Toronto, clutching a clipboard and pretending her hands weren't shaking. She had been on the job for 3 days, officially listed as a temporary admin assistant for the post-production team. In reality, she was little more than a glorified runner, fetching coffee, organizing call sheets, and being invisible to the actors and executives around her. She was fresh out of college with a literature degree and no real connections. Just a quiet determination to work hard, stay humble, and maybe, just maybe, carve out a place for herself in the film world. She didn't want fame. She just wanted to be part of something creative, something bigger than herself. Clara had grown up in a small town where success meant owning a hardware store or teaching 5th grade. Her parents were proud she had graduated, but they didn't understand why she'd moved to a noisy city to chase something so vague. "A job is a job," her father had said. "You're smart. Be a librarian. Something stable." But Clara wanted more than stability. She wanted motion. She wanted to be around stories. The production was chaotic. Last-minute rewrites, technical issues, delays with extras. The director yelled a lot. Assistants came and went. Clara kept her head down and her ears open. She never spoke unless spoken to, but she remembered everything, which is why she was the one who corrected a mislabeled location on a revised script before it was printed and handed out to the crew. No one noticed, except one person, Keanu Reeves. He had been pacing nearby, rehearsing under his breath. He paused when he saw her, double-checking the paperwork at the printer. Most people walked past assistants without a second glance. He stopped. "Did you just fix that line before anyone else caught it?" he asked. Clara froze, then nodded. He gave a small smile. "Good eye. That line would have sent the whole crew to the wrong rooftop." "I read fast," Clara said quietly, "and I remember small things." Keanu studied her for a moment, not in the way other actors sometimes looked at women on set. His gaze was thoughtful, kind. "What's your name?" "Clara." "Clara," he repeated. "Well, thanks for saving us an afternoon of yelling." He walked off. She didn't expect to speak to him again, but she did. Over the next few weeks, Keanu seemed to notice her more often. Not in a dramatic way, just small moments. He'd ask where a specific folder had gone, and she'd already have it in hand. He'd mention needing a last-minute script update, and she'd appear with a revised copy before he could finish the sentence. Clara never sought his attention. In fact, she actively avoided it. But something about her quiet precision seemed to anchor him. On a set where everything changed constantly, she stayed calm. She didn't push, she didn't flatter, she just did the work. One afternoon, the power went out in the trailer during a rainstorm. The director threw a fit. Half the crew took an early lunch. Clara stayed behind, trying to salvage soaked paper from the production binder. Keanu walked in with 2 coffees, saw her kneeling by a puddle, and offered 1 cup without a word. They sat across from each other in the dim light, sipping in silence. "You're not like most people I meet on sets," he said. Clara raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like a compliment. Or a warning." "It's a compliment," Keanu said. "Most people in this business talk a lot. You don't, but you notice everything." She shrugged. "Talking's easy, listening's harder." That made him smile. When the movie wrapped, Clara assumed it was over. The job would end and she'd move on to the next odd assignment. Maybe data entry or background work on another indie shoot. She was already preparing a generic resume update when her phone rang. It was Keanu's agent. "He'd like to offer you a full-time role," the woman said. "He's looking for a personal assistant. He asked specifically for you." Clara blinked. "There must be a mistake. I don't have the experience for that." The agent chuckled. "He said to tell you that experience doesn't matter. He needs someone he can trust, someone who listens." She didn't say yes right away. She thought about it for 3 days, talked to her brother Julian, called her mother, stayed awake at night wondering if she was making a mistake by accepting something so sudden. But deep down, she knew. This was one of those doors that only opened once. If she said no, it would vanish forever. On a quiet Friday morning, she met Keanu at a small coffee shop on Queen Street. No cameras, no entourage, just him and a notebook. "You really want me to do this?" she asked. "I do," he said. "Where is he?" "Because you don't try to impress me. You just do what needs to be done. I need someone like that." She took a deep breath. "Okay," she said. let's try it. Neither of them realized then how deeply those words would shape the rest of their lives. Her first day was quiet, like most days with Keanu were. He gave her a desk in a sunlit corner of his home office, showed her a few paper calendars, a handwritten to-do list, and a chaotic inbox full of fan letters and production requests. "You organize things however makes sense to you," he said. "I trust your instincts." Clara worked 12 hours that day, and the next, and the one after that. She didn't just organize, she transformed everything. His schedule became tighter but more breathable. His inbox got answers. The letters, dozens of them from children, veterans, grieving fans, got sorted. Clara wrote drafts for responses Keanu would later personalize by hand. He was surprised by how easily she understood him. She learned his rhythms, knew when he needed a quiet morning, knew which charities he gave to without ever publicizing it, knew how to deflect invasive questions from journalists without seeming cold. She made his life lighter without ever getting in the way. And Keanu noticed. One night after a long day of back-to-back interviews, he leaned against the doorway of her tiny office space and said, "I think I'd be lost without you." Clara looked up from her notes and smiled. "You'd be fine. You've survived worse." "Maybe," he said. "But surviving isn't the same as having someone at your side." She didn't reply, but she remembered that line for a very long time. Weeks turned into months, months into years. Clara never imagined she'd stay long, but the work never felt temporary, it felt personal. They traveled together for shoots, festivals, hospital visits, and benefit dinners. He learned that she hated flying, so he always booked aisle seats for her. She learned that he forgot to eat when he was stressed, so she kept snacks in her bag at all times. What started as a job became something else, something deeper. Not romantic, not then, but something rooted, intimate in a way that words couldn't quite capture. 17 years before she walked away, Clara Jennings said yes to a quiet man who asked for her help. She didn't know then that the decision would define nearly every part of her life, that it would bring her closer to someone who saw her clearly when no one else did. She also didn't know how much that choice would cost her in the end. But at the beginning, all she knew was this: he asked her to stand beside him. And she said yes. Clara Jennings learned how to disappear in plain sight. In a world that glorified chaos, she made order. While agents, producers, and publicists came and went, Clara stayed. She didn't take photos on set, she didn't drop names at parties, she never leaked anything to the press. Her job wasn't just about managing schedules, it was about protecting the person behind the spotlight. Keanu's life moved in cycles. Filming, press, recovery, repeat. And Clara became the steady rhythm behind it all. She packed his bags before he realized he needed to leave. She rearranged flights when delays threatened to ruin appearances. She tracked down a child's lost letter from 2 months ago and made sure it got a handwritten reply. She set reminders for birthdays. Not just Keanu's, but his sisters, his goddaughters, even the makeup artist he once called a miracle worker after an allergic reaction on set. She coordinated small gifts with handwritten notes that always sounded like him because she had learned his tone better than anyone. And she watched the way Keanu smiled at fans even when exhausted, watched how he grieved quietly after a former co-star passed, watched how he stood silently outside a hospital room after visiting a child with terminal cancer. She became fluent in his silences. At night, she often stayed late organizing mail. Keanu insisted on reading every fan letter, even if he couldn't respond to them all. Clara created a system, color-coded tabs, folders by country, filters for urgent needs. Sometimes she would slip in extra notes, drawing his attention to letters from grieving parents, war veterans, or kids fighting illness. One time, she left a note on top of a letter from a boy in Kansas who'd lost both parents in a car accident. "His drawings remind me of the one your sister Kim used to send," she wrote. Keanu didn't say anything, but the next day he wrote back to the boy and included a sketch of his own, a motorcycle beneath a wide-open sky. Clara never asked what it meant. She just filed the reply and smiled. There were moments when Clara felt like she was the only person who truly knew the man behind the image. She knew what kind of tea calmed his nerves before interviews. She knew the sound he made when he was pretending to laugh. She knew when a script line rubbed him the wrong way even if he never said so. But the world didn't see that. They saw Keanu Reeves, the stoic, generous, untouchable star. Clara saw the man who once drove across the city just to deliver a scarf to a former stunt double going through chemo. The man who asked her to keep track of charities anonymously, refusing to let his name appear even once on the donation records. He trusted her with everything. She had access to his accounts, passwords, medical records, flight history. She knew the names of every school friend he'd kept in touch with, even if they only spoke once a year. She remembered what year his mother had been hospitalized for heart surgery. She kept a folder of his sister's letters in a locked drawer in his study. But what meant the most to her wasn't what she managed. It was the way he made her feel, respected, valued, seen. He never raised his voice to her, never brushed her off. If she said something was important, he listened. If she warned him about someone's intentions, he paid attention. And yet, despite all that closeness, there was always a line, a quiet understanding between them. This is work. This is trust. This is not love. Not the kind you name, anyway. Still, there were moments that blurred the boundaries. A late-night phone call after a tough day, a lingering glance when the rest of the world turned away, a small thank you note left on her desk with her favorite quote from a book they both loved. "You were never ordinary," the note once said. Clara tucked it away in her planner and never mentioned it again. Years passed, seasons changed. The world outside grew louder, faster, more invasive. Inside Keanu's orbit, Clara kept things still. She booked quiet dinners instead of award show parties. She scheduled interviews around his grief anniversaries. She reminded him to call people he loved, even when he didn't feel like talking. She carried tissues in her purse for him on the day they visited the grave of a director who had believed in him when no one else did. She never asked for more, and he never said what he sometimes looked like he wanted to. That was their rhythm, and it worked. On the surface, their relationship was seamless. Every assistant Keanu had before her had lasted 6 months, a year at most. Clara stayed 17. The media occasionally speculated, a photo of them walking side by side, a rumor from a crew member, a red carpet moment where she hovered at the edge, clipboard in hand, while Keanu gave a rare, genuine smile. But they never gave the press anything. Keanu would say, "She's my assistant, my colleague, my anchor," and move on. Clara would nod and return to her spreadsheets. But in private, they shared more than logistics. She knew when his nightmares started after certain films. He knew how she liked her tea brewed exactly 3 minutes, no more, no less. She learned which days of the year he didn't speak much, anniversaries of loss. He learned how to read her silences, too, especially after she visited her father in the hospital during his final months. They didn't need to speak everything aloud. Their understanding ran deeper than that. Still, Clara sometimes wondered what it would mean if one of them ever broke the silence. If he ever said, "I need you for more than just the work," or if she said, "I think I fell in love with you somewhere between the chaos and the quiet," but neither of them did. Instead, they carried on, one day at a time, one task at a time, one shared glance at a time. She scheduled his flights to Kyoto for a silent retreat. He brought her back a hand-carved notebook with her initials pressed into the leather. She reminded him to drink water during long rehearsals. He made sure she always had a seat at the table, even when others didn't understand why the assistant mattered so much. Theirs wasn't a story anyone would call romantic. There were no declarations, no grand gestures, no confessions in the rain, but it was love. The kind built on loyalty, on presence, on years of walking beside someone without needing to be seen. Clara had no photos of the two of them together in her apartment, but she had the letters, the notes, the memories. She had the sound of his voice, asking gently, "Are you okay?" when no one else noticed she was pale after skipping breakfast. She had the quiet trust of a man who lived in the public eye and gave her the only thing he didn't give anyone else, his private life. And in return, she gave him hers. She became the one person who never asked for anything more than to stand beside him, the invisible engine behind his peace, the silent witness to his storms, the person who knew him completely. And that kind of love, Clara believed, was worth everything, even if no one else ever saw it. The gala had gone on longer than expected. Velvet gowns, bow ties, champagne flutes. Clara had floated quietly behind Keanu, clipboard in hand, discreetly managing the press line, guiding conversations, and deflecting invasive questions with gentle precision. The evening had been a fundraiser for a pediatric cancer foundation, one of Keanu's favorite causes. The cameras caught the speeches, the applause, the celebrity handshakes, but no one saw the fatigue behind his smile. It wasn't until nearly midnight that they finally slipped out through the back exit, away from the flashes and small talk. Clara had secured a driver, but Keanu waved it off. "Let's walk," he said. She hesitated, then nodded. They walked 3 blocks in silence, the air crisp with the scent of autumn. The city shimmered with late-night traffic and the soft hum of neon. Eventually, they reached the rooftop of the old studio building where they had once worked on his first indie film, after she became his assistant. The security guard still recognized Keanu and let them up without a word. At the top, the city unfolded beneath them like a glowing map. Buildings blinked, cars moved like slow fireflies, and above it all, the stars peeked through, faint but determined. Clara wrapped her coat tighter around herself, the night air nipping at her neck. Keanu stood a few steps away, hands in his pockets, gaze distant. "You okay?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer at first. Then he spoke, his voice soft and even. "I don't always know who I am when I'm in there," he said, nodding toward the city below. "At events like that, I say the right things, smile at the right moments, but I feel like I'm wearing someone else's face." She didn't respond. She never did when he spoke like that, not until he needed her to. "I've done a lot of pretending in my life," he continued, "even off camera. Pretending I'm fine, pretending I'm not exhausted, pretending I'm still that version of myself people built in their heads." His voice trailed off, and for a long moment there was only the wind. Then he turned to her. "But you never asked me to pretend." Clara's breath caught. "You're the only person who knows the real me." Her heart beat once, hard, then settled into silence. Clara turned away from him for a moment, pretending to look at the skyline. She didn't know what to say. His words echoed in her chest like a bell struck softly but deeply. She had spent 17 years beside him, tracking every meeting, protecting his privacy, navigating his grief and joy and fatigue. But in all that time, neither of them had crossed the line. They had walked up to it, maybe, paused there, but never stepped over. "You don't have to thank me," she said eventually. "I didn't do anything special." "You did," he replied. She shook her head. "No, I just stayed." "Exactly," Keanu said. "That's what no one else did." He stepped closer. Not much, just enough that she could feel his presence more clearly. It wasn't threatening, it was steady, familiar. Clara folded her arms, more to ground herself than to warm up. Her pulse was too loud in her ears. "You once told me," he said, "that listening was harder than talking." She remembered. It had been a throwaway line during a stormy night in a trailer. One of the first real things she ever said to him. "I've never forgotten that," he added. She looked up at him then, really looked. There was no mask tonight, no performance. Just a man who had let her see the raw edges of his life, and somehow still believed she had given him more than he gave in return. "You don't know what you give me," she whispered. He took one slow step forward. "I think I do." Their hands brushed. Barely. It wasn't a touch, not really. Just the whisper of warmth between two people who had spent years pretending that the line between them was made of stone. Clara's breath caught again. She didn't move away. Neither did he. But the moment lingered too long. The silence became heavy with everything they'd never said. And then he stepped back, not out of rejection, but restraint. He smiled, soft and sad. "We should get back." Clara nodded. Her throat felt tight. They walked back to the elevator, side by side, closer than usual but still not touching. Neither of them spoke on the ride down, but something had shifted, and they both felt it. In the car, Keanu stared out the window. Clara kept her hands in her lap. The driver said nothing. The city blurred past them in streaks of light, but neither of them saw it. Clara felt like her skin was buzzing. She kept replaying the rooftop moment in her head, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. The pause, the nearness, the shared breath between what could have happened and what didn't. When they reached his house, Keanu opened the door, then turned back to her. "You want to come in?" he asked. He never asked that, not after work hours. Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "I've got early calls to confirm for next week," she said, voice quiet. He nodded. No argument, no insistence, but something in his eyes flickered, just for a second. "Good night, Clara." "Good night." He shut the door. She sat in the car for another 2 minutes before telling the driver to go. Her hands trembled in her lap the entire way home. That night she didn't sleep. Neither did he. The next day, things went back to normal. Almost. He still left coffee on her desk in the morning. She still slipped notes into his folder. They still exchanged glances in meetings, spoke in shorthand, read each other like pages from a book. But something had changed. A charge in the air. But knowing in the silence, she found herself thinking more carefully about what she wore. He began to pause a little longer when thanking her for something small. They moved more gently around each other, as if afraid the wrong word might undo the balance. They never talked about that rooftop moment. Not once, but it lived between them, quiet and steady, like everything they'd ever shared. And that silence, so full of meaning, was louder than any confession could have been. Because sometimes love doesn't declare itself. It waits, fingers. It learns your shape in the dark and chooses to stay, even when it's never named. And that night on the rooftop, beneath the city lights and the pale constellation of stars above, something between them had shifted from service to something sacred. Something they would carry. Something they would never admit. Something that would one day make saying goodbye feel impossible. For the next several years, Clara and Keanu lived in a space that didn't have a name. It wasn't romance, not openly, and it wasn't just a working relationship either. It was something else, an emotional closeness neither of them dared to define. From the outside, their roles hadn't changed. Clara remained his assistant, his gatekeeper, his confidant. But something about the air between them had grown heavier, softer. The way she lingered after handing him a schedule. The way he looked at her across a crowded room. These were not things ordinary colleagues did. And yet, there was never a step over the line. Never a kiss, never a confession. Just a growing silence between them that held more than words ever could. Keanu continued to trust her with everything. Scripts, contracts, travel. But more than that, his memories, his fears, his hopes. When his sister's cancer went into remission, it was Clara he called first. When he lost an old friend to a sudden stroke, It was Clara who sat beside him at the funeral, holding his hand when the eulogies became too much. They didn't speak of what they were. They just were. Sometimes that silence was a comfort. Sometimes it felt like a wound. Clara knew she was in love with him. It wasn't a crush or infatuation. It was the slow, permanent kind. The kind that doesn't scream. It settles into the bones, into the breath, into the spaces between seconds. But she also knew that saying anything would break everything they'd built. So she said nothing. She simply stayed. She smiled at the right times, answered the phone when it rang, and made sure the world didn't touch him too harshly. And Keanu, he never asked for more. He couldn't. Because even though he felt something too, something deep and steady and growing, he had lost too much in life to risk what little peace he had found. There were moments, though, that almost unraveled them. One night during a film shoot in Iceland, the crew had wrapped late and everyone gathered at a small inn to share stories over dinner. Someone poured too much wine. Someone else played an old guitar. Laughter filled the room. Keanu and Clara sat in the corner, quietly watching. And then someone asked the question that always came up, eventually, "Are you two a thing?" The room fell quiet for half a breath. Clara's cheeks flushed. Keanu didn't flinch, he just smiled. "No," he said gently. "She keeps me alive, that's all." The others laughed, and the moment passed. But later, in the dark hallway outside their rooms, Clara paused. He had stopped in front of his door, hand on the knob, then turned to her. "I didn't mean to embarrass you." "You didn't. I just don't know what else to call this," he said. Clara looked at him, her voice steady but low. "You don't have to call it anything, just don't ask me to explain it." He nodded and walked into his room without another word. That night, Clara sat awake in her bed, the silence of the landscape pressing in from all sides. She stared at the ceiling and thought about how something so beautiful could feel so unfinished. The rumors came and went like waves. Paparazzi photos, blog speculation, tabloid headlines that meant nothing and everything. One article called her the most discreet woman in Hollywood. Another claimed she had been secretly married to Keanu for years. Clara never corrected them. Keanu never read them. When asked in interviews, he'd laugh softly and say, "Clara's not my girlfriend. She's something more useful. She keeps my head on straight." The world moved on, but the weight between them grew heavier. It followed them into hotel lobbies, onto film sets, into quiet kitchens where they brewed coffee, side by side, without saying a word. Clara learned to live in that in-between space, to smile without expectation, to love without asking, to stay close without reaching out. And Keanu, in his own quiet way, held her there. Never too far, never close enough. They developed rituals that no one else knew. Every Monday morning, he left a folded note on her desk, sometimes a quote, sometimes a question, sometimes just a line from a book they'd once shared. She replied with sticky notes on the edge of his screen. Jokes, movie references, words that meant little to anyone else but everything to them. On his birthday, she gave him a small stone she'd found on the beach during a retreat, shaped like a heart, unpolished and rough. He kept it on his desk for years. When she got sick for a week and stayed home, he sent daily voice messages, not about work, just checking in. One of them said, "I miss having you nearby." She listened to that one twice before deleting it. Still, nothing was ever said aloud. That was the price of staying. If they named it, they'd have to live in it. And neither was sure they could do that and remain whole. Clara tried dating once. A man named Theo, a screenwriter with a gentle smile. They went out 3 times. On the 4th date, she canceled at the last minute. She didn't tell Keanu why, but he noticed. "You okay?" he asked later that week. "Yeah," she said, "just tired." He nodded. "You know you don't have to explain yourself to me." But she wished she could. She wished she could say, "I can't love anyone else because I already gave it all to you." But instead she smiled and went back to reviewing flight schedules. Time moved forward. Projects came and went. And still, they hovered in that unnamed place. Too close for strangers, too silent for lovers, too sacred for words. Some part of Clara hoped it would always be this way, because even in its ache, it was beautiful. It was rare, and it was hers. But another part, a quieter, lonelier one, knew this kind of tension couldn't last forever. One day, something would have to give. One day, the silence between them would stretch too far. But for now, they lived in it. They walked side by side through airports, through film sets, through loss and recovery and rainstorms in Tokyo. And every time their hands brushed, they both felt the pull. The not yet, the never was, the could have been. And they chose, again and again, to live in the space between. The letters came in stacks. Every week, a new bundle would arrive from the fan mail agency. Thick envelopes with crayon drawings, carefully typed pages, and folded notebook paper with glitter stickers pressed along the edges. Some were from fans asking for autographs. Others included photos of movie posters and hand-drawn portraits of Keanu mid-stunt. But it was the ones from children that always landed differently in Clara's hands. Most of them had been sorted and categorized: requests, thanks, support, the usual. But sometimes a few slipped through the cracks, letters with handwriting so shaky it was barely legible, or ones that arrived late because they'd been forwarded from a hospital or school counselor. Clara had always been meticulous with the mail. For years, she maintained a careful log of every reply Keanu personally sent, something he insisted on doing by hand, even if it took hours. But even he couldn't respond to them all. So, one afternoon, as she sat in the quiet corner of the home office, Clara opened a pale blue envelope from a boy named Liam in Montana. He was 8 years old. His letter began with, "Dear Mr. Reeves, I don't talk good, but I like your movies where you fight bad guys and save people." Liam's mom had added a note at the bottom explaining that Liam had autism and struggled with speech, but watched Keanu's films on repeat, especially the ones where the hero didn't talk much but still did what was right. Clara read it 3 times. Then she picked up a blank card, signed Keanu's name with his careful block lettering, and added something he might say. "You are strong and brave, Liam. Keep being the hero of your own story." She slipped a small comic book into the envelope. No announcement, no return address, just something for him to hold. That night, she didn't mention it to Keanu. It felt private, and maybe selfish. But she kept doing it. The next week, there was a letter from a girl in Ohio named Tori. She was 10, obsessed with martial arts, and wrote that she wanted to be a stunt woman just like your friends in the movies. Clara smiled. She reached out to an old stunt coordinator contact from one of Keanu's earlier films and asked for a list of beginner-friendly training schools that offered scholarships. Then she printed it, folded it neatly, and mailed it with a signed postcard and a handwritten note that said, "Tori, the world needs more women like you." Keanu never knew, and Clara never told him. It became a quiet ritual. Every Sunday morning, Clara would brew tea, sit by the window with the soft light on her lap, and go through the week's letters. She kept a separate file for the kids, a label she scribbled on a manila folder in pen, then traced over in pencil. It included names, birthdays, schools, and a few drawings taped inside the cover. There were dozens of stories. A boy with leukemia, who asked Keanu to please keep making movies because they make the hospital less scary. A girl from Texas whose father had been deployed overseas. She sent a drawing of Keanu standing in front of a flag and wrote, "You remind me of my dad. He doesn't talk much either, but he cares a lot." Clara would write something short and meaningful in reply, Sometimes she included small things, stickers, a quote, a postcard from wherever they'd last traveled. She kept everything anonymous, no names, no self-credit, just a single intention: to make sure these children knew they were seen. The more she read, the more she realized how many of them weren't asking for anything extravagant. They just wanted to feel heard, to feel connected to someone they admired. And that, Clara understood deeply. She had spent her life standing next to a man the world idolized, and she knew that it wasn't the fame or the money or the roles that made him extraordinary. It was the fact that he noticed things most people missed. He cared when no one was looking. Clara wanted to offer that same quiet magic back to these children. One day, she received a thick envelope from a middle school in rural Oregon. Inside were letters from an entire classroom of students, each thanking Keanu for a speech he gave on a talk show years earlier about grief. Their teacher, Ms. Garrison, wrote that many of the kids had lost parents to overdose or violence. She had shown them the clip to help them feel less alone. Clara sat with those letters for hours. Eventually, she sent a care package to the school with copies of books about resilience, a collection of short essays Keanu had once quoted in an interview, and a handwritten note signed in his name. "Your stories matter. Your pain does not erase your future. Keep going." She didn't even tell him. It wasn't about Keanu. It was about them. Clara never kept records of what she sent. No spreadsheets, no receipts. It wasn't for publicity. It wasn't even for Keanu's legacy. It was for the small girl who once sat alone in a library during recess, reading books to escape her own silence. The girl who never thought she'd find a place where her voice mattered. The girl Clara had once been. Helping those children made the silence in her life easier to carry. Some nights, she would sit by herself with the letters and think about the irony. She was changing lives behind the curtain of someone else's shadow, and no one would ever know. Once, while organizing old files in the office, Keanu noticed a drawing on her desk, one of the ones sent by a little boy in Vermont who had sketched a scene from The Matrix with stick figures and big red arrows. He pointed at it and smiled. "Where'd that come from?" Clara didn't even flinch. "Fan mail, just sorting the batches." He nodded. "Cute kid. That stuff really gets me sometimes." She just smiled and placed the drawing back in the folder. Then she tucked it away in the bottom drawer, right next to a small photo of a girl in a wheelchair from Arizona who had sent a thank you note after receiving a box of books. Clara had never asked for thanks, but every so often one would come. A message from a parent, a teacher, a counselor. One read, "You don't know what your letter meant to my son. It gave him something to believe in." Another said, "We framed the postcard. She says she'll look at it before every big test." Clara kept those messages in a separate envelope labeled "Proof of Light." It was the only thing she ever kept for herself. Years passed, and the letters kept coming. Most were filtered, some went unread. But every time a child's envelope found its way into Clara's hands, she stopped whatever she was doing. Because in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the work, not the pressure, not even the unspoken ache that lived between her and Keanu. She had found a different kind of purpose, a quiet mission, a secret that belonged only to her. And in those letters, in those small connections forged across distance and silence, Clara rediscovered something she'd thought she'd buried long ago. Oh, hope that love didn't always need to be returned in the way you expected. Hope that making a difference didn't require applause. Hoped that being invisible didn't mean being powerless. Because sometimes the smallest voice in the room leaves the deepest echo. And Clara Jennings had learned to listen for it. The invitation came on a Thursday morning, folded neatly between script pages on Keanu's kitchen table. Clara was flipping through his shooting schedule when she found it, handwritten on a small note card in Keanu's familiar pen. "Thinking of spending a few quiet days at the cabin before production begins. Would you join me? I'll need help with prep and it'd be good to have you there. No signature. He didn't need one. Clara stared at the note longer than necessary. The request was professional on the surface, but the timing felt different. Personal. His next film was rumored to be a major biopic. Heavy, emotionally demanding, the kind of role that required more than memorizing lines. Clara had been through this rhythm before. She knew how seriously he prepared. But this time, he wasn't just booking her a room nearby or checking logistics. He wanted her there, with him. 3 days later, they arrived at a private cabin tucked into the woods of Northern California. It was the same place he'd gone to write after his last heartbreak, years ago. Clara had booked it then, too. But she'd never stayed. Now she stood on the porch beside him, looking out at the still trees and low-hanging fog. Inside, the cabin was simple. Stone fireplace, wide windows, 2 bedrooms divided by a narrow hallway. He unpacked his books and notes while Clara set up her laptop at the small wooden table near the window. By evening, the fire was lit, and the silence between them had settled into something warm. They spent the next 2 days reviewing the script, walking the trail behind the cabin, and cooking quiet meals together. Clara watched as Keanu disappeared into the emotional fabric of the role, practicing lines under his breath, staring out at the woods between sentences, like he was chasing memories that didn't belong to him. He didn't talk much, but she didn't need him to. He kept the kettle warm. She reread scenes with him late into the night. She made notes in the margins that he didn't ask for but always read. And on the 3rd night, something shifted. They had just finished dinner, roast vegetables, bread, and the last of a bottle of wine neither of them had planned to open. The fire crackled low, and the lights were dimmed to a soft amber. Keanu sat across from her in the large armchair, the script balanced on his knee, but he wasn't reading. He was watching her. Clara felt the weight of his gaze, and for a long moment, she didn't move. Then he said it. "If my life were a film," he said slowly, "you'd be the one who held it together behind every scene." Clara blinked, stunned by the words. He hadn't looked away. His voice hadn't wavered. He wasn't smiling either, not deflecting. He meant it. She let out a soft breath, her heart thudding in her chest. "That's a generous thing to say." He shook his head once, firm but quiet. "No, it's not. It's true." The firelight danced across the room, painting shadows across the stone wall behind him. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His tone shifted. Gentler, deeper. "You've been there through everything, Clara. Every loss, every high, every breakdown. I didn't ask you to carry that with me. But you did, without ever needing to be seen." She swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry. "I didn't carry anything," she said softly. "I just stayed close." He looked down for a moment, then back at her. "There's something about that, about being seen, really seen, without having to explain yourself." Clara held his gaze, but her hands tightened in her lap. He knew where this was going. She could feel the words rising in his chest. She could see the struggle on his face. The quiet war between restraint and surrender, between the safety of silence and the risk of confession. For a flicker of a second, she wanted to make it easy for him, to close the space, to say something that gave him permission to fall. But she didn't, and he didn't. Instead, he said, "I think there's a version of me that wouldn't have made it if you hadn't stayed." It was the kind of sentence that lingered long after it was spoken. Clara nodded slowly, the air between them thick with everything unsaid. She whispered, "You would have made it." He shook his head again. "Not the same way." Then he leaned back, as if retreating from the edge of a cliff. He let out a soft breath and closed the script on his lap. Clara looked down at her hands. Neither of them said anything else for the next 5 minutes. Eventually he stood, offered her a quiet good night, and walked to his room. She stayed by the fire, unmoving. The flames burned lower, casting soft shadows across the wood-paneled floor. Clara sat motionless, hands curled into fists on her knees. She could still hear the echo of his voice, still feel the weight of the almost, the words that hovered just behind his lips but never crossed them. She had imagined it before, wondered what it might sound like if he ever said how he really felt. But nothing had prepared her for how much it would hurt to hear almost everything and still have to act like it meant nothing. She rose slowly, moving to the window. Outside, the forest stood in silent stillness. The sky above the trees shimmered with stars, and the air inside the cabin felt thick with something holy and unfinished. Clara pressed her forehead to the cool glass. She didn't blame him. He had given as much as he could. And in truth, maybe it was more than she had expected, but still, the ache was sharp. Back in her room, she sat on the edge of the bed and covered her face with both hands. No sobs, no dramatic gasps, just quiet tears slipping down her cheeks. She wept like someone who had held in everything for years, like someone who finally understood the difference between being loved and being chosen. She wasn't angry. She was grateful, but she was tired of living in the pause between sentences, tired of memorizing his silences, tired of making a home in someone else's restraint. She lay down in the dark, eyes open, and listened to the quiet of the cabin around her. Somewhere down the hall, Keanu's light went out. His footsteps moved once, then stopped. She wondered if he was lying awake too. The next morning, neither of them mentioned the night before. Keanu made coffee, Clara packed the last of the papers, they reviewed the schedule for the shoot, they joked about the groceries they hadn't used. But something was different. Not broken, not ruined, just quieter. As they drove away from the cabin, Clara watched the trees blur past and thought of the firelight, the weight of his eyes, and the sentence he never finished. And though he never said the words, she would carry them with her. Not as a promise, but as a truth too fragile to touch. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped through the mail slot with the rest of the usual clutter. Utility bills, a recipe magazine Clara never remembered subscribing to, and a single large envelope with no return address. The handwriting on the front was printed in all caps, uneven and smudged. Her name was spelled correctly. That alone was enough to give her pause. She set the rest of the mail on the counter and held the envelope in her hands. Something about its weight felt wrong. Too thick, too heavy for paper alone. Clara tore it open at the seam and pulled out a stack of glossy photographs. At first, her mind didn't process what she was seeing. Then her stomach dropped. The first image was of her and Keanu outside the cabin, him holding the car door open while she laughed at something he'd said. The second was even closer, their shoulders touching as they stood side by side on the porch. The third was a still from their final night there, the firelight casting shadows through the window. She recognized it instantly, but the fourth image is what made her knees weaken. It showed the two of them inside the cabin, Keanu leaning forward, his hand gently resting over hers, her eyes locked with his. A moment so private, so quietly intimate, it shouldn't have belonged to anyone else. Her breath caught. Beneath the photos was a folded sheet of paper, typed. Cold. You know what this looks like. So will the rest of the world. $250,000, 0 cents by the end of the month. No cops, no leaks. You'll receive instructions soon. Clara read it again, and again. Her hands began to tremble. She sat down slowly, pressing a palm to her forehead. The air felt thinner. The silence in her kitchen screamed. This wasn't just about her. It was about him. Clara knew the stakes immediately. Keanu had built his life on quiet dignity. He wasn't flashy. He didn't chase headlines. He moved through fame with careful steps and deliberate silence. His privacy wasn't a luxury, it was a shield, and someone was now trying to rip it away. She spread the photos across the table and stared at them, one by one. None of them were indecent, nothing technically inappropriate, But the context, the emotion, the closeness would be more than enough to fuel weeks of speculation if they ever surfaced. He had trusted her. He had trusted her. Clara stood and paced the room, heart pounding. She thought through her options. Go to the police? Risk making this even bigger? She imagined Keanu's face if he found out. Not the anger, he rarely ever showed that. It would be the quiet hurt, the disappointment. The way he'd withdraw, not from her, but from the world. He'd been burned before. The tabloids had torn through his grief when his girlfriend died years ago. They had stalked him outside funeral homes, followed him into grocery stores, dissected his silences, and invented entire fantasies out of his loneliness. She couldn't let it happen again. She picked up the letter, read the demand again. $250,000. It wasn't an impossible amount, not for Keanu. But for her, it would mean every savings account drained, every investment sold, every safety net gone. And still, she didn't hesitate. Because this wasn't about money. This was about protecting the only person who had ever truly seen her. And she couldn't let him pay that price, not when the invasion was her burden to carry. By the next morning, she had moved the photos into a locked drawer in her desk. She began researching anonymous cash drops, burner phones, and mail rerouting services. The idea of navigating this alone was terrifying, but telling Keanu? That was unthinkable. He was days away from starting production on his most emotionally demanding role in years. He needed clarity, focus, stillness. She would not be the thing that shattered it. For the next 2 weeks, Clara carried the weight in silence. She smiled through scheduling meetings, coordinated wardrobe fittings, fielded calls from producers, flight coordinators, and press managers. Every moment she spent beside Keanu, she pretended nothing had changed. But inside, everything had. She barely slept. She kept her phone volume on high through the night in case another message came. She checked the mailbox 3 times a day. Every time an unmarked car parked across the street, her chest tightened. And all the while, Keanu remained his usual self, steady, thoughtful, unaware of the storm circling inches from his life. One evening, as they walked out of a production meeting together, he turned to her in the elevator. "You okay?" he asked. Clara smiled too quickly. "Yeah, just a lot of moving parts right now." He nodded. "You've been quiet?" "I'm always quiet." He studied her for a second longer, then nodded again. "You're better at hiding it, that's all." The doors opened before she had to reply. That night, Clara sat at her desk long after midnight, rereading the blackmail letter. No follow-up had arrived yet, no instructions. That was almost worse than if they had. The silence was a threat in itself. A countdown with no clock. She imagined what might happen if the photos leaked. Not just the media frenzy, but what it would mean. Keanu's character would be questioned, his professionalism. The assumptions would flood in: affair, scandal, manipulation, all of it aimed at a man who had done nothing but care, gently, and exist privately. She wouldn't let that happen. But deep inside, something else gnawed at her. The fact that the photos existed at all meant someone had been watching them. Not just from a distance, but closely. They had captured private, unguarded moments. That required more than luck. It required time, knowledge, intent. Whoever it was, they had been close. Too close. That realization chilled her more than the threat itself, because it meant her world, Keanu's world, had already been breached, and it meant someone out there was waiting, watching, and ready to destroy them both. The moment Clara realized she couldn't keep going wasn't loud. There was no sudden panic, no crashing revelation. It came quietly, like a candle burning out while you weren't looking. She was standing in her kitchen, staring blankly at her phone screen. She had opened the same app 3 times in the last 10 minutes, unable to remember what she was trying to do. Her inbox overflowed. She had 2 calls scheduled with studio executives in the next hour. Keanu's dry cleaning was waiting. His new flight itinerary had to be confirmed before midnight. And yet, she couldn't move. 3 days of sleepless nights had unraveled her. She had gone through the motions like always. Coffee, emails, schedules, quiet coordination behind the curtain of his life. She had sat beside Keanu in cars and meeting rooms, smiled when he glanced her way, made sure no one ever noticed the storm gathering in her chest. But now, standing in the quiet of her home with the blackmail letter locked in a drawer across the room, Clara felt something break loose. Not a panic attack, something worse. Numbness. She sat down at the table and placed both hands in her lap to stop them from trembling. No second message had arrived, no phone call, no new photos. Just the silence. The heavy, intentional kind that felt like someone watching her through a keyhole, waiting for her to make the next move. It was psychological warfare, and she knew it. But knowing didn't help. She had tried to tell herself it would pass, that the threat would dissolve if she ignored it. But she was too smart to believe that. They had the photos. Whoever it was had seen something true, something fragile and unscripted. And it wasn't just about gossip or scandal. It was about leverage, about turning real connection into currency. Clara had spent 17 years guarding Keanu's life like a fortress. She knew how sacred his privacy was, how much it cost him to let anyone in. If this got out, not just the images, but the implications, they'd destroy more than his reputation. They'd destroy the space they had built, that invisible trust neither of them ever named aloud. And she wouldn't survive seeing him retreat from her. That was the thought that did it. She closed her eyes, drew in a slow breath, and knew, really knew, what had to happen. She couldn't risk his name, his peace, his career. So she would erase herself, quietly, on her own terms, before anyone else did it for her. Clara didn't cry, not that night. She moved like a shadow through her apartment, gathering small things, personal folders, private journals, the USB drives she kept hidden behind books. She didn't need to pack everything. She wasn't running. She was planning a retreat, not an escape. The goal wasn't to vanish completely. Just enough, just far enough that the threat would dissolve into disinterest. Her laptop screen glowed softly in the corner of the room. She sat down and opened a blank document. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a long time. Finally, she typed, "Dear Keanu, I've been thinking about this for a long time." The words spilled out in slow waves. She kept it neutral, polite, professional. A farewell, dressed in the clothes of reinvention. She blamed creative fatigue, emotional exhaustion, the need for a new chapter. She praised his generosity, thanked him for the trust, emphasized how proud she had been to support his journey all these years. She didn't mention the photos, or the blackmail, or the way her hands shook every time a car slowed in front of her house. When she finished, she signed it, "With love," but not literally. No closing lines that could be misread. Just her name in clean serif font. She printed the letter, folded it precisely, and slipped it into a blue envelope. On the front, in small handwriting, "For Keanu." She could have stopped there. She almost did. But then she opened a second document. This one wasn't for him to read. Not yet. It was raw. "You're not in danger yet, but I am," it began. "And if I tell you, you will be too." She poured it out. Everything. The envelope, the photos, the message. The panic she'd felt. The choice she was making now, not because it was brave, but because it was the only thing left that might protect what they'd built. "You've always said the work mattered more than the noise, that your life should be about the people you helped, not the things they said. So I'm making a noise go away." She wrote about the nights she couldn't sleep, the shame of hiding this from him, the unspoken ache of standing beside him and never being able to cross the line they'd both drawn. She didn't tell him she loved him. She didn't have to. It was there, in every sentence. When she printed that second letter, her hands didn't shake. She folded it slowly, placed it in a plain white envelope, and wrote nothing on the front. Then she slid it into the bottom drawer of her desk and locked it. If something happened, she'd leave instructions. But for now, the truth would stay buried. He would only get the version she was ready to give. The goodbye, wrapped in dignity. The lie with clean edges. She gave herself one more night. One more evening to walk through the familiar rhythms of the job. One last day of being near him without the mask cracking open. When she saw him the next morning, he was already reviewing the revised pages for the film. He glanced up, smiled like always. "You sleep?" he asked. Clara nodded. Eventually, he watched her for a second longer, something flickering in his eyes. She looked away before he could see too much. Throughout the day, she handled every task with perfection. Finalized the travel logistics, coordinated with wardrobe, smoothed a last-minute issue with the studio rep. No one would suspect anything was wrong. She made sure of that. Even when Keanu joked about needing her on set for the next project, even when he called her the quiet North Star in front of the makeup team, she smiled and said nothing. That evening, after everyone else had left, she slipped a blue envelope into the center drawer of his office desk, right on top of the calendar he checked every morning. Then she stepped back, took one last look at the room she'd quietly helped build for over a decade, and turned off the light. She didn't say goodbye, not in person. She knew that if she saw his face, if she saw confusion or pain, or the quiet question in his eyes, she wouldn't be able to go through with it. So she drove home, and she wept. Not violently, not loudly, as quietly, steady tears that carried 17 years of devotion, restraint, and unspoken love. The next morning, her phone buzzed just once, his assistant confirming the new hire paperwork had been submitted. Keanu hadn't called. He never did when she took breaks. He always gave her space. She wondered if he thought this was one of those times. But this wasn't a break. It was an ending, and only she knew why. She made breakfast, drank her coffee in silence, and opened her planner to a blank page. No schedule, no calendar, no flight numbers. Just white space. A life without him. She sat with it, let it hurt, and then, finally, she closed the book. The invitation was hand-painted, slipped into a light pink envelope and delivered by courier to Clara's door 2 days after she left. Inside, a small card read, "We're celebrating 17 years of quiet magic. You made all of us better. Come, let us tell you so, in person. Thursday, 6 p.m. Stella's Cafe, where you always ordered tea but stole the cookies. Casual. No speeches, just love. The team." She held the card for a long time. The handwriting belonged to one of Keanu's makeup artists, Mia, who had once called Clara the human version of a deep breath. Over the years, Mia had watched Clara manage chaotic schedules, smooth over emotional meltdowns, calm nervous extras, and quietly remember everyone's birthdays without fail. Mia knew, like the rest of the crew knew, that Clara was more than just an assistant. Clara smiled when she saw the location. Stella's. It was the little cafe 2 blocks from the studio lot. It had chipped ceramic cups, bad lighting, and the best lemon cookies in the city. She had once confessed to Keanu, half joking, that those cookies had probably saved her mental health more than therapy. She set the card on the table and stared at it. She would not go, not because she didn't love them, but because she couldn't stand in a room full of people celebrating something she wasn't ready to grieve out loud. They didn't know the truth. They thought she had chosen rest, transition. They didn't know she had chosen loss, loneliness, silence. They didn't know she was protecting someone who would never ask her to. Instead of dressing for the cafe that evening, Clara drove east, past the city limits, through the dusty back roads of a childhood she hadn't returned to in years. The sun hung low over the valley when she arrived at the town where she'd grown up. A quiet place filled with secondhand bookstores, antique signs, and memory. She parked in front of the little white church at the edge of the cemetery. The iron gate creaked when she pushed it open. The gravel path felt soft beneath her shoes. She knew exactly where to go. Row 3, stone 7. Her mother's name was etched in the granite without flourish, just a simple inscription. Margaret Lin Chen, 1954-2008. Grace in motion. Clara stood for a long time before sitting on the grass beside the headstone. The wind stirred through the pines. A bird called twice and then flew away. "I didn't go," she whispered. "To the party." She let the words sit there. "I couldn't. I think I would have fallen apart." She traced the edge of the stone with her fingertip. "Do you remember when I told you I didn't believe in soulmates? You laughed at me. You said I hadn't met the right person yet." Her voice caught, but she kept going. "I think I did, but I wasn't supposed to, and I definitely wasn't supposed to love him from the sidelines for nearly 2 decades." She paused. "I loved him, Mom. Not in the way movies write it. Not in a fairy tale way. I loved him in the quiet way. The kind of love that gets your coffee right and remembers the color of your silence." She wiped her cheek. "And now I'm gone. Because I had to be." She closed her eyes and breathed deep. "I don't know if I'll ever see him again." Clara didn't stay long. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, she placed a yellow flower at the base of the stone. Wild and a little crooked, just like her mother had liked. She whispered goodbye, walked back to the car, and sat in the front seat for 10 full minutes before turning the ignition. On the way back into the city, the sky darkened and the streetlights blinked on one by one. Her phone buzzed twice in the cup holder. Messages from friends asking where she was. Someone had posted a picture from the cafe. It was dimly lit and filled with warm faces. A small sign read, "We love Clara," in hand-cut paper letters. She didn't reply. Instead, when she got home, she turned on the television to distract herself. But fate had other plans. A talk show was playing, and Keanu was the guest. He was mid-sentence when she tuned in, laughing about a fan encounter on the subway. His voice was calm, steady, familiar. And then the host asked, "So your longtime assistant just retired after 17 years. That had to be emotional, right?" Keanu paused, smiled faintly. "It was," he said. "Harder than I thought it would be." The host leaned in. "You've had a pretty private life. We rarely see people stay with one person for that long. What made Clara special?" There was a long silence. Keanu looked off camera for a moment, then back. "She saw everything," he said. "All of it. The worst days, the real me, the parts I don't show anyone. And she never used any of it for leverage. She never asked for attention or credit. She just made sure I stayed standing." He hesitated. "I'm the strongest person I've ever known." Clara didn't move. She couldn't. The screen blurred as her eyes filled. Then the tears came. Not quiet ones, not polite ones. She wept into her hands like a woman who had held back too long. Not because of what he said, but because he didn't know why she'd left. Because he was sitting there, honoring her, trusting her, and still carrying a silence he didn't know had nearly destroyed her. She wished in that moment that she'd left the second letter on his desk instead of locking it away. But she also knew she wasn't ready to shatter what they had with the truth. Not yet, maybe not ever. So she turned off the TV, wiped her face, and whispered one final word into the quiet room. "Thank you." Keanu didn't notice the quiet at first. In the beginning, it just felt like a normal off day. A script revision here, a coffee cup slightly colder than usual, an itinerary that arrived on time but without Clara's small notes in the margins. The ones she used to write in pencil. Soft reminders like, "Remember to smile today," or "They love you more than you know." The first 2 days passed with the hum of distraction, but by the third day, he felt it in his chest, a stillness that wouldn't leave. It wasn't just her absence, it was the absence of her rhythm. Clara had been more than an assistant. She had been part of his nervous system. Her presence had woven itself into the seams of his life, quietly filling the spaces between work and rest, noise and silence. And now, every room echoed. Sophia, the new assistant, was excellent, smart, efficient, always 3 steps ahead. She brought him fresh pages in the morning, color-coded scripts, protein smoothies made from expensive ingredients that probably extended his life. But when she smiled, it didn't reach her eyes. And when she spoke, he realized how much he missed not needing to explain things. He tried to push through, booked meetings, rescheduled a shoot he had postponed the year before. But when the cameras rolled, something was off. His delivery was flat. His movements lacked spark. He looked into the lens and couldn't connect. Directors noticed. So did the crew. "Everything okay, Keanu?" someone asked gently. He nodded, forced a half smile. "Just tired." But it wasn't fatigue. It was grief. Grief in the shape of a woman who had walked beside him for 17 years and vanished, with nothing but a folded letter and a sentence he couldn't get out of his head. "Thank you for letting me believe in something bigger than myself." He read it every night now, memorized it, and still it gave him no answers. The house changed. He stopped using the kitchen where Clara used to brew her tea. The scent of chamomile had long faded, but his memory kept replaying her quiet hands moving through the cabinets, knowing where everything was without looking. He didn't enter the sunroom anymore. It was where she used to sit with stacks of mail, sorting letters from fans with careful fingers and a highlighter tucked behind one ear. He tried. He told himself time would smooth the ache. But each day made her absence louder. One morning, a letter arrived, addressed not to him, but to Miss Clara. The return address was a hospital in Michigan. He opened it slowly. It was from a little boy named Mason, who had written before. Keanu remembered the name. Clara used to read the boy's letters aloud sometimes, smiling when Mason talked about pretending to be John Wick while wearing a cape made from his mom's old bedsheet. This letter was different. It read, "Dear Miss Clara, the medicine you sent helped me feel strong again, and I liked the books. I read them with Mom. Are you okay? Mom says people leave when they're tired, but I hope you're not too tired. Please come back. Mr. Keanu probably misses you like we do. Love, Mason." There was a drawing folded inside. Stick figures of a man, a woman, and a little boy standing in front of a big movie screen. Keanu stared at it for a long time. Then the second letter came. Then a third. All from children Clara had quietly supported without telling him. Some had met her in passing at fan events. Some had never met her at all, only received thoughtful replies and unexpected packages in the mail signed with a looping C. One envelope had crayon hearts on the outside and a message inside that read, "Where did Miss Clara go?" He didn't know what to say. To them, to himself. He placed the letters in a drawer, not to forget, but because he couldn't face the truth yet. He had spent his life avoiding drama, avoiding the spotlight unless it served a purpose. And yet, somehow, the one person who made the noise bearable was now gone. He didn't talk about her publicly. Not again. He canceled his next interview, delayed the press tour, and on the day of the premiere, he stood on the red carpet alone, hands in his pockets, smile thin, answering questions with practiced restraint. Reporters asked about the film, about legacy, about roles. No one asked about Clara, but her name echoed in his mind like a song he couldn't turn off. Weeks passed, then months, and the silence between them remained. Keanu no longer looked at his phone hoping for a message. He had stopped expecting closure. But that didn't mean he stopped feeling the gap her departure had carved into his life. He thought of her most at night, the late hours when the house was quiet and his thoughts wandered uninvited. Sometimes he imagined what she might be doing now, reading in a small cottage somewhere, sitting in a coffee shop with her journal, laughing with someone who didn't know her past. He hoped she was safe. He hoped she was free. But he also couldn't help the selfish ache that rose when he remembered how she'd left. No goodbye in person. No explanation. Just that envelope. And the softest betrayal of all, protecting him without asking if he wanted protection. He tried to talk to Sophia once. He said, "Do you think people can disappear for good without hating you?" She paused, caught off guard. "Sometimes," she replied. "Sometimes people disappear because they love you too much to stay." It stayed with him. He opened the drawer again that night, the one with the children's letters. He spread them out on the table, dozens of drawings, messages, misspellings, stick figures, bright colors. He realized something. Clara hadn't just kept his world moving. She had quietly changed lives behind the scenes, without seeking credit, without applause, just like she had done for him. Every day, for 17 years. The next morning, Keanu called his manager and told him to cancel everything for the rest of the month. He needed time, not to move on, but to finally face the silence she'd left behind. He walked to his home office, opened the center drawer of his desk, and unfolded the original letter again. Then, for the first time, he whispered something into the quiet that no one else heard. "I miss you." And for once, the silence didn't answer back. Clara Chen didn't choose a new life. It arrived slowly, like dusk settling over an old town. There was no grand announcement, no career shift in a glossy magazine, no sudden reinvention. She simply walked into the front door of a non-profit one quiet Thursday morning and asked if they needed help. The woman behind the desk was startled by how direct she was. Clara looked calm, polished, but carried the heaviness of someone who had known too many secrets for too long. "You're not here for a role, right?" the woman asked carefully. "This is a non-profit. No salaries. Mostly chaos." Clara smiled. "Good. I'm here to help." They gave her a clipboard and a chair. The non-profit was called Frame Forward, a modest arts program that mentored girls between 12 and 18 in film, acting, and storytelling. The building was a renovated warehouse on the edge of town, still smelling faintly of drywall and dust, with mismatched chairs and cracked tiles. None of that mattered. What mattered were the girls. Some were bold and loud, others painfully shy. Most had never seen a real camera before. All of them carried stories like shields, some heavy with trauma, others wide with dreams. Clara spent her first week organizing supplies and cleaning storage closets. By the second week, she started editing scripts. By the third, she was coaching monologues behind the curtain, her voice soft, her encouragement even softer. No one knew her past. She didn't offer it. But the director of the nonprofit, a retired actor named Juanita, noticed something. "You don't just work here," she said to Clara one day. "You leave pieces of yourself in everything." Clara looked away. "I just want to give what I never had." Juanita didn't press. She nodded once. That was enough. The girls at Frame Forward began to gravitate toward Clara, especially one. Her name was Lila, 14 years old, a sharp mind hidden beneath baggy hoodies and silence. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then, her words came slow, like she was testing the air before committing. Clara noticed how Lila hung back during group readings, but stayed after class to refold the costume rack. One day Clara found her crying behind a prop curtain. She didn't ask what happened. She just sat down beside her, close but not touching. Eventually, Layla whispered, "Why are you so kind to me?" Clara thought for a long moment, then answered, "Because someone once was kind to me when I didn't know how to ask for it." From that moment on, Layla never called her Clara again. She called her Miss Hope. The nickname caught on, and soon other girls began using it too. Clara didn't correct them. In fact, part of her was grateful. Clara had disappeared from the world the day she walked away from Keanu's life. Maybe Miss Hope could be someone new, someone useful. But no matter how full her days became, the hollow space inside her didn't close. She'd see Keanu's face sometimes, on billboards, news headlines, streaming thumbnails. He was everywhere, and yet nowhere in her life. She didn't read the interviews anymore, didn't watch the premieres. But once, in the grocery store line, she overheard a young couple talking. Did you know Keanu's assistant of like 2 decades just left? Some say he's not the same without her. The girl showed a clip on her phone. Clara didn't watch, but that night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window with a cup of tea wrapped in an old sweater as the city whispered outside her apartment. A single lamp cast shadows on the walls. She reached for her journal but hesitated. Then she pulled out a blank piece of stationery, thick, cream-colored, the kind she used to keep for Keanu's correspondence. She wrote his name at the top, and then she let go. Dear Keanu, you once told me that if your life were a film, I was the one who held it together behind every scene. I never got to say this before, but you were the only person who ever made me feel like I was part of something worth film. I didn't leave because I stopped caring. I left because I cared too much. There are parts of my heart I never knew how to protect around you. And when the time came to choose between my truth and your peace, I chose your peace. You taught me what love could be. Quiet, unwavering, dignified. And I hope, in my own small way, I taught you what trust means. I never asked for anything in return because your belief in me was the greatest gift I've ever known. Some days I think about the rooftop, the city lights, that silence between us. I think we both knew what it meant. But love doesn't always need to be spoken aloud. Sometimes it's strongest in the things left unsaid. I miss you. And I hope you're okay. Too. She read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in a wooden box with no address. She didn't plan to send it. Not now, maybe not ever. Some truths were meant to live in the quiet, but she felt lighter just for having written it. The next morning, she arrived at Frame Forward early. Layla greeted her at the door with a grin, holding up a rough script she had written overnight. I think it might be a real movie, she said. Clara took the pages and smiled. It already is. Julian Chen hadn't meant to find it. He wasn't snooping, he was doing what any protective older brother would do. Helping Clara move out of her apartment on a rainy Saturday that seemed to echo the low hum she'd carried in her soul for months. She hadn't been herself since she left Los Angeles, and he'd quietly noticed the small things. The way she paused before answering questions, the tired smile, the growing collection of unsent letters she never talked about. She had brushed off his concerns, claiming it was just time for change, that she wanted a quieter life, more meaningful work. Working with the girls at the nonprofit fills me up in a way nothing else ever did, she told him once. And maybe that was true. But Julian had always felt there was something more. They were sorting through old boxes stacked in the hallway closet. Papers, framed photos, books Clara couldn't decide if she wanted to keep. A worn manila folder had slipped behind the cabinet's bottom panel, hidden from view. Julian pulled it free, assuming it was more bills or paperwork from her time in the film industry. He popped open the clip. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Not posed or professional, candid, personal. Clara and Keanu Reeves, at cafes, backstage, on set, laughing, smiling, faces turned toward each other like the world around them had fallen away. In one photo, Keanu was handing her a scarf. In another, their hands brushed as they reached for the same coffee mug. There was nothing scandalous about them, but there was intimacy, a quiet, irrefutable closeness. Julian's heart pounded harder as he reached deeper into the folder. Folded neatly behind the stack of photos was a single envelope. No return address, no name, just a plain white sheet of paper, typed in black ink. The message was short, but the words left no doubt. "We know about you and Mr. Reeves. $250,000, 0 cents to keep it buried. This is your only warning." Julian stood there in the middle of Clara's hallway, the air around him thick and silent. He read it again and again. Then he walked into the kitchen and placed the folder gently on the table. When Clara saw what he was holding, the color drained from her face. Clara didn't speak at first. She set down the glass she was washing, dried her hand slowly, and lowered herself into the chair across from Julian. Her eyes never left the folder. When she finally looked at him, it was with the kind of exhaustion that only came from carrying something far too long. "I was going to destroy it," she said softly, "but I couldn't." "I don't know why." Julian stared at her. "Why didn't you tell me? Or Keanu?" Clara reached for the letter, held it between her fingers like it was something poisonous. "Because it would have changed everything. You don't understand the kind of pressure he's under. His life isn't like mine. One rumor, one wrong photograph, and suddenly it's headlines, speculation, people with cameras in his bushes again." She paused, eyes glistening. "He doesn't deserve that. He's already been through so much." Julian leaned forward, voice tight. "But he deserves you, and he deserves the truth." Clara shook her head. "He deserves peace, privacy. That was always what I tried to give him." Julian's hands curled into fists on the table. "Clara, you walked away from everything. You built a life with that man, not in the public sense, but in every way that matters. And you let it go because of this?" "I wasn't going to let someone else control the narrative," she said. "So I took control of it myself. I left." Julian was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a low voice, "Did he ever tell you he loved you?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Julian sighed and stood up. "Where is he now?" "Vancouver," Clara whispered. "Filming." He grabbed the folder. "You don't need to alert. What are you doing?" "I'm going to see him." "No, Julian, don't. You can't protect him from the truth forever." She followed him to the door, pleading with him to reconsider. But Julian was already gone, disappearing down the front steps with her past tucked under his arm. And she stood in the doorway for a long time after, watching the street like it might return him before the damage was done. Vancouver was gray when Julian arrived. Clouds hung low over the city, and the studio lot felt like a world removed from the rest of it. The production assistant on duty was skeptical at first, but Julian's voice was calm, his eyes clear. "Tell him it's about Clara." That was all it took. 10 minutes later, Keanu stepped outside the trailer, dressed down in jeans and a black hoodie. He looked tired, but alert. His eyes narrowed slightly when he saw Julian. "You're Clara's brother." Julian nodded. "Julian." Keanu looked at the folder in his hands. "She's okay." "He's surviving," Julian said. "But she's not whole." Keanu didn't respond. "She didn't leave because she was burned out," Julian continued. "She didn't leave because she wanted to find herself, or because she needed a career change. She left to protect you." He held out the folder. Keanu took it without a word. "There are photos in there," Julian said. "Letters, a threat, blackmail." The wind picked up slightly. A gull cried overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a director shouted for reset. Keanu stared down at the folder, his hands still for a moment. Then he turned and walked back into the trailer. He sat down on the worn leather couch, the only sound the ticking of the small wall clock above the window. With slow, careful movements, he opened the folder. The photographs slid out first. He recognized them immediately. He remembered every moment. Clara, laughing at something he'd said, Clara handing him a pen, Clara looking at him like he was something rare and fragile and good. He set the photos aside, then opened the letter. He read it once, then again. The words were simple, clinical, threatening. But the truth behind them? It undid him. His chest tightened, his jaw clenched. He thought back to the morning he walked into his office and found Clara gone. The goodbye note. Her final words. The pain that settled in afterward like fog that never lifted. And now, this. All along, she had been protecting him, even when it cost her everything. A knock came at the door. 5 minutes, Mr. Reeves, a voice called. He didn't answer. Instead, he sat there for a long time, the folder resting on his lap, the weight of 17 years pressing down on him. And for the first time in months, Keanu Reeves closed his eyes and whispered her name. Clara. Keanu Reeves landed in San Francisco under a haze of overcast skies, but his mind was far more clouded than the weather. For days, he'd replayed Julian's words, the envelope, the photographs, Claire's trembling goodbye. There was no escaping the ache now, no pretending it hadn't cracked open something too sacred to ignore. He had stayed silent long enough. From the moment Julian left that folder in his hands, Keanu knew exactly what he had to do. It wasn't damage control. It wasn't about making things right for the public. It was personal. This was about the one person who had stayed beside him longer than anyone else, not for the fame or the spotlight, but because she believed in who he was beneath all of it. He hadn't even told Sophia where he was going. He canceled the afternoon shoot with only a brief message to production. A single change of clothes stuffed into a backpack. No security team, no press. Just a plane ticket and the desperate hope that he hadn't waited too long. The community center was tucked away in a quiet corner of the Mission District, modest and warm. There was a chalkboard sign out front that read, "Young Voices Speak, Courage in Storytelling with Clara Chen." Keanu stared at the sign for a full minute, his heart pounding. Inside, folding chairs lined the room. The walls were covered in drawings, some stick figures, some hopeful poetry from the girls the nonprofit served. He slipped in quietly at the back of the room and stayed standing. Nobody turned around. Clara stood at the front, facing 30 middle school girls, her voice calm but passionate as she spoke. She was dressed simply, hair pulled back, no makeup. But she glowed. Not with fame, with truth. She was telling them about stories. How stories saved lives. How her life had been changed by someone who never sought the spotlight, but taught her what it meant to stand beside someone in silence. She didn't name him. She didn't need to. "I used to think courage was loud," Clara said, her voice steady. "But sometimes it's just choosing not to walk away when the silence gets hard." Keanu swallowed hard. His breath caught in his throat. That sentence, those exact words, were the same ones he had once whispered to her on a rooftop, years ago, when he thought no one was listening. He didn't realize how tightly he was gripping the strap of his backpack until his knuckles turned white. She still remembered. The applause that followed was gentle but full. Clara stepped down from the makeshift stage, girls surrounding her like bees to a flower, each eager to speak, to be heard. She knelt to their height, hugging, laughing, scribbling notes in small journals they handed her. She made time for each of them. Keanu stepped back outside. He waited under the old tree near the edge of the sidewalk. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what he would say when she finally saw him again. The doors creaked open as the event wrapped up, and the girls poured out in excited clusters, waving drawings and chattering about what they'd write next. Keanu stayed still, watching each face as it passed, searching for the one that had once been the calm center of his entire world. And then there she was, Clara walked out slowly, her tote bag heavy with journals and lesson plans. She looked up to thank the last girl's mother. And then she saw him. She froze. Her breath hitched as her eyes locked on his. She didn't move, not for a full 3 seconds. Neither of them did. In the space between them, 17 years of memories stood like silent witnesses. He took a cautious step forward, his hands visible, his face soft. "I read your letter," he said. Her shoulders dropped. She exhaled like the air had been trapped inside her since the day she left. "I meant every word," she replied. He nodded, slowly. "You thought you had to protect me." Clara's fingers tightened around the tote strap. "You know what they would have done with those pictures. It would have become a circus. You've lived your life with dignity. I couldn't be the one to pull you into the dirt." He stepped closer. "You've always stood in front of the storm for me, always. But you never let me stand beside you." She looked down, blinking quickly. "Because if I did, I wouldn't have left. And if I stayed, you might have paid a price I couldn't bear." He didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded photo, the one of them laughing over a broken prop during that indie shoot in New Mexico years ago. The one the blackmailer had sent. He held it out. "This wasn't shameful," he said. "This was real. It still is." Clara looked at the photo, then at him, tears rising again. She turned slightly away, brushing at her eyes. "You don't get to sacrifice yourself for me," he continued, voice low. "Not anymore. Not alone." She turned back slowly, her voice breaking. "But I'm no one. You're the person I trusted with my entire life." He said it with a stillness that stopped the wind around them. There was no performance in his voice, no grand confession, just truth. Clara took one shaky step forward, then another. Her arms dropped to her sides. Keanu reached out, gently, like he wasn't sure if he had the right. But she didn't move away. Their hands met, her fingers wrapped around his. He didn't let go, and she didn't need to speak to let him know she had waited for this. For him, for a long, long time. Clara took one final breath, then stepped into him completely. Her forehead rested lightly against his chest, and for a long moment, the street, the city, the world faded behind the rhythm of a heart that had once kept her anchored through the hardest years of her life. Keanu held her, not tightly, not possessively, just enough for her to know that this time he wasn't letting her carry it alone. The way she trembled in his arms wasn't out of fear. It was release. All the restraint, all the silent years, all the swallowed words and stolen glances, they spilled from her in one long, quiet sigh. She didn't apologize, and he didn't ask her to. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were wet but steady. She studied his face as if she were memorizing it again, just in case this too might be taken away. "I thought I lost you," she whispered. "You didn't," he replied. "You just walked too far ahead for a while." Her lip trembled. "It hurt." He nodded. It did. They stood there in silence, the kind that says everything without words. Around them, the traffic returned. A dog barked from a nearby apartment window. The clouds began to part, just enough to let a sliver of light through. Clara reached into her bag and pulled out something small and folded. She hesitated, then placed it in his hand. "I wasn't going to send this either," she said. He unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was unmistakable. On the page, only a few lines. "You taught me what love could be. I hope I taught you what trust means." He stared at the words. Then he looked at her. "You did," he said softly. "Every single day." Tears slipped down her cheeks again, but this time they weren't heavy. They were soft, cleansing. He touched her cheek, wiped one away and smiled. Just barely. Just enough. "Come home," he said. Clara closed her eyes. "Not the job," he added. "Just come back into my life." She opened them again, her gaze steady. "Only if we stop pretending. We stopped pretending the moment I flew here." She gave a small, honest laugh. "Shaky, beautiful. Then, yes." They began walking, side by side, slowly down the street. Nothing grand, no music, no paparazzi. Just two people who had finally chosen truth over fear. She leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. "By the way," he said after a beat, "you were always more than an assistant." She looked up, curious. "You were the only person who ever let me be human." She didn't reply. She just reached for his hand again. And this time, she held it in the open. No shame, no hiding, just them. 3 weeks after San Francisco, Keanu stood at the edge of a quiet art studio, watching Clara speak to a new group of girls. This time, he wasn't hiding. He sat beside a few parents and mentors, nodding quietly as the girls spoke about their scripts, their dreams, their fears. Some talked about stories they were too scared to write. Others brought messy, beautiful pages full of hope. Keanu didn't speak during the session, he just listened, the way Clara did. And that, perhaps more than anything, made the young women trust him. Later that afternoon, as they walked out into the parking lot together, Clara smiled gently and said, "You didn't have to come today." "I did," he replied. "I wanted to see what you built, and I want to help." She turned, curious but cautious. "Help? I want to fund your program," Keanu said. "Whatever it takes, salaries, equipment, scholarships, a permanent space." Clara blinked, stunned. "Keanu, I'm not asking you to be my assistant again," he added quickly. "This isn't about me giving you anything. This is about building something. Together. You've given your whole heart to this. I want to be part of it." Clara crossed her arms, the breeze lifting her hair slightly. "Then I have one condition." He raised an eyebrow. "This time," she said, "we build it side by side. No more hiding behind desks or letters or long silences. No more protecting each other by disappearing." Keanu nodded once. "Deal." They shook on it. Not because they had to, but because it felt like the beginning of something new, something honest. By the end of that month, Keanu had quietly funded the foundation of the Hope Story initiative, Clara's program for young women in storytelling and film. But instead of simply signing checks, he attended meetings. He listened. He helped set up chairs. He brought in friends from the industry to mentor the girls, not with ego, but with presence. Clara watched him with quiet awe, not because he was famous, but because he showed up. And he stayed. In mid-April, a podcast reached out. It was a small but growing show, focused on mentorship and creativity. The host asked if Keanu and Clara would join together to speak about the program. Keanu turned to Clara and asked, "What do you think?" She hesitated, then smiled. "Let's do it, but let's tell the whole truth." Keanu agreed. They didn't rehearse, they didn't plan every word. They just showed up. When the interview aired, it didn't make headlines because of controversy or scandal. It made headlines because of one line Clara said that went viral. "Love doesn't always come as lightning. Sometimes it builds like sunrise, quiet, steady, and too beautiful to hide forever." The clip was viewed over 20 million times in a week. People didn't comment about how glamorous they looked. They commented about how safe they made each other feel. The viral moment didn't change them. It didn't make Clara rush into anything or push Keanu into the spotlight he always preferred to avoid. What it did was open a door they'd kept shut for too long. A door that allowed others to finally understand the quiet power of what they had built. After the interview, something unexpected began to happen. Letters started arriving again, not for Keanu alone, but for Clara too. Young women wrote to say they saw themselves in her. Teachers thanked her for speaking with grace about trust. Even parents of fans reached out to say that their children had never been more inspired to write, to speak, to dream. One message, handwritten in bright blue ink, came from a teenage girl in Missouri. Ms. Clara, I used to think I had to be loud to be seen, but you showed me that kindness can be strong too. You and Mr. Keanu are the proof. Clara read that note out loud one evening as they sat together on her balcony, sipping warm tea in mismatched mugs. She handed him the card and gave a small, quiet smile. I never imagined being seen like this, she admitted, not after hiding for so long. Keanu looked at her, his eyes steady. Maybe you were never hiding. Maybe the world just wasn't ready for the way you shine. She laughed softly, leaning her shoulder against his. You always know what to say. He shook his head. I just say what's true. Together, they continued working on the initiative. Keanu offered acting workshops, not to teach performance, but to show the girls how to express truth without fear. Clara organized sessions on screenwriting and editing, often staying late into the night to help a student finish her story arc or rewrite a scene that didn't feel authentic. They traveled together to different cities where their program was expanding: New York, Austin, Seattle. Every time they stayed in modest hotels, took long walks between meetings, and carved out quiet dinners where no one needed to say much. Sometimes, when they walked into new spaces, people assumed Clara worked for Keanu. He always corrected them gently. No, this is Clara's vision. I just believe in it. That shift mattered. It became part of the story the world began to see. Not the star with the silent assistant, but two people who had carried each other through the weight of years, only to emerge stronger, more honest, and side by side. They never made a big announcement. There were no red carpets or staged photos. But then one morning, a photo surfaced on social media. Keanu and Clara sitting on a bench outside a school, sharing a sandwich and laughing over something written in a notebook. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and it was love. The kind you build when no one's watching. A few months later, the initiative reached a milestone: its 1,000th student. Clara organized a celebration at the original community space in San Francisco, the same one where she'd first taught under borrowed lights and peeling posters. This time, the room was bright, the walls were filled with framed student art, and rows of folding chairs were packed with families, mentors, and alumni. Keanu stood near the back of the room as Clara took the stage. She wore simple black slacks and a soft gray blouse. No makeup, no spotlight chasing her, just her voice, steady, strong, and full of gratitude. I never imagined I'd be standing here, she said. There was a time when I thought I had to disappear to protect something precious. But what I've learned is this: real trust doesn't ask us to vanish. It asks us to stay and grow together. The room fell into a thoughtful hush. Then she smiled and nodded toward the back. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you get to build with someone who sees you even when you're silent. All eyes turned as Keanu walked forward, hands in his pockets, eyes warm. He didn't take the mic. He just stood beside her, and for the first time in public, they didn't hide. They were simply present. The photo from that night, the two of them standing close, her hand lightly on his arm, was shared across countless blogs and magazines, but not because it was shocking. It was shared because it felt like hope. Hope that love could exist without performance, that people could leave and come back, that truth could outlast fear. In a follow-up interview, when asked if they were officially together, Keanu smiled softly and said, "We're walking through life honestly now. I think that's enough." Clara was asked something else. Do you regret leaving? She paused, thoughtful, then said, I regret the fear, not the love, never the love. Their foundation received thousands in new donations after that, but it was never about the money. It was about the girls. It was about the letters. It It was about building something with open hands instead of closed fists. One evening, long after everyone had left a writing retreat they'd hosted together, Keanu found Clara sitting on the porch of a quiet cabin. She was reading from an old, wrinkled notebook, the one she used to write letters she never sent. He sat beside her. "Writing to me again?" he asked, half teasing. She closed the notebook gently. "Not anymore." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm not writing love letters I won't send," she whispered. "I'm living them now." And as the wind moved gently around them, neither of them needed to say anything more. Because finally the future wasn't something they feared. It was something they'd build. Together, a soft breeze moved through the open window, fluttering the edge of the curtain like a memory too shy to settle. Clara sat on the small couch in their shared cottage just outside Los Angeles. It was quiet that morning, the kind of stillness that made everything feel deeper. Her tea had gone cold, untouched, resting on the table beside a stack of letters tied in a ribbon. She pulled one from the top and opened it slowly, careful not to tear the handwriting that looked like it had been written with trembling hope. "Dear Miss Clara, my name is Layla. I'm 12 years old. My mom says I used to be shy, but now I say I'm just quiet. I saw your interview with Mr. Reeves. I didn't know someone could be quiet and still strong. You made me believe in quiet heroes. Thank you." Clara stared at the words for a long time. Then she folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the ribbon stack. Her eyes shimmered, but there was no ache in her chest this time, just warmth. She rested her hand on the envelope, closed her eyes, and smiled. Across the room, Keanu was seated at a small writing desk, his reading glasses perched on his nose, a faint crease between his brows. He was reading a letter of his own, the corners of the page worn from being folded and unfolded many times. His voice broke the silence. "She wants to be brave like me," he said. Clara turned. "Who?" Keanu held up the letter. "A boy named Elijah. He says he saw one of our workshops and now he wants to stand up for his little sister when the world is mean." Clara's lips curled into a soft smile. "That's the work, isn't it?" He nodded. "That's everything." He got up and walked to her, still holding Elijah's letter in his hand. He sat beside her and offered her the page. Clara took it, read it silently, and then leaned her head on his shoulder. They sat there for a while, both holding letters from children who saw them not as celebrities or heroes, but as proof that goodness could be quiet and love could be steady. Clara broke the silence first. "Do you remember the day I left?" Keanu nodded slowly. "I told myself I was doing it to protect you," she said. "But the heartbreaking truth isn't that I had to leave. It's that I didn't believe I was already enough." Keanu turned slightly and looked at her with the kind of softness that required no words. "You were always enough," he said gently. Clara didn't respond with words. She just reached for his hand and held on. Later that afternoon, Clara walked into the backyard garden with a small stack of envelopes, each one waiting for a reply. The garden had become her sanctuary. Raised beds of tomatoes, lavender, and rosemary lined the fence. A wind chime whispered softly in the breeze, the same one Keanu had hung up for her when they moved in. She took a seat at the old wooden table beneath the shade of an olive tree and opened her journal. The first line she wrote wasn't meant for anyone else to read. "Today I feel full in a way I never thought I deserved." For years, she'd lived in the shadow of her own silence, always careful not to disrupt, not to dream too loudly, not to let her love for someone like Keanu rise past the surface of professionalism. And yet, here she was, answering letters from girls who called her Ms. Hope, living in the very space she used to only write about in those unsent letters. She read another note, this one from a mother in Montana. "Thank you for showing my daughter that love doesn't have to be loud. She wants to write stories now, not for fame, but because she finally believes she has something to say." Clara pressed her hand gently to her chest and breathed in deeply. For a long time, she thought strength had to be sacrifice, that the most loving thing she could do was walk away. But now she understood something different, something deeper. Sometimes love meant staying. Sometimes it meant standing in the light together, even when the fear of being misunderstood still lingered. Inside, Keanu prepared tea. 2 cups, the same mismatched mugs they always used. One read "Stillness Speaks." The other had no writing at all, just a fading blue glaze. He brought them out quietly and placed hers beside the journal. He didn't say anything right away. He just sat down, leaned back in the old garden chair, and looked out at the roses beginning to bloom. "I used to think solitude was my strength," he said. Clara turned toward him. "But now I think it was a way to avoid asking for help," he continued. "You changed that." "I didn't do anything dramatic," she replied softly. "That's the point," Keanu said. "You didn't have to." They sat there for a while, the letters between them, the day slowly softening into golden light. Then Keanu reached across the table and placed one hand over hers. "No more unsent letters," he said. Clara nodded, her eyes brimming. "Only shared stories, now." And so they sat, 2 storytellers who had once lived in the space between lines, now finally writing their lives on the same page. A year passed, quietly, beautifully. The foundation Clara had once imagined in fragments became something real and thriving. With Keanu's support, but always under her direction, it expanded into more cities, more schools, more hearts. Girls who once thought they had no voice now wrote scripts that won local festivals. One had even landed a scholarship to UCLA's film program. Another had just sold her first short film to a streaming platform. But success wasn't measured by accolades. It was measured by the confidence in their voices, the quiet joy in their letters. On the first anniversary of her departure, the day that had once felt like an end, Clara found herself sitting with Keanu at a community event, surrounded by students, parents, and volunteers. A small girl with bright eyes and paint-stained fingers walked up shyly, clutching a notebook. "Miss Clara?" she whispered. Clara smiled gently. "Yes, sweetheart?" The girl handed her a folded piece of paper. "This is for you." Clara opened it slowly. It was a drawing. 2 figures holding hands beneath a tree. One wore glasses like Keanu. The other had her curly hair and a calm smile. At the bottom, written in uneven letters, were the words, "Love doesn't hide." Clara felt something in her chest shift, an old ache turning into something warm and whole. She turned to Keanu and showed him the drawing. He smiled, took her hand, and whispered, "She gets it." Later that evening, back home, Clara lit a candle on the porch. It had become her quiet ritual, a moment to remember where she came from, a way to honor her mother, her younger self, the journey that had brought her here. Keanu joined her, a blanket over his shoulders, barefoot on the cold wood. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. Clara looked at the stars. "That maybe the scariest thing isn't leaving. It's believing you're not enough to stay." He nodded slowly. "And now, I know better," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then said the words he had never needed to say before, but now felt right. "I love you." Clara smiled, her eyes gentle. "I know." They didn't kiss for the cameras. There were no fireworks, just 2 hands clasped tightly. 2 souls who had wandered through silence and sacrifice, now anchored in something honest. And then, Clara opened one last letter before bed. It was from a girl named Layla. "Miss Clara, I used to think people like you only existed in stories, but now I know you're real. You made me believe in quiet heroes." Clara closed the letter, eyes misted. Then, as the screen fades, she says one final line. "The heartbreaking truth isn't that I had to leave. It's that I didn't believe I was already enough." Have you ever walked away from someone you loved to protect them? Tell us your story in the comments below. And what kind of story would you love to see next with Keanu?